Greetings, wanderers. Tonight, we drift back to prehistoric times when we shared this planet with 8 other human species. And some of them should have outlasted us. The Neanderthals had bigger brains and could see in near darkness. Homo erectus had colonized 2 continents and survived for nearly 2 million years. The mysterious Denisovans thrived in harsh mountains where we couldn't even breathe. Yet today they're all gone, but our species, Homo sapiens, are still here. How did we become the last human standing? If you find comfort in these gentle explorations of history's stranger corners, you're welcome to like and subscribe, but only if my words give you peace of mind. And before you drift too deep into the past, do leave a comment. Tell me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. I'm always curious to know how these old stories find you in your corner of the world. Very well, it's time we settle in, dim the lights, and uncover the story of humanity's greatest survival mystery. Picture walking through a museum and seeing the skeleton of Homo erectus for the first time. You might think you're looking at a modern human who lived a very long time ago, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. These ancient relatives of ours had figured out something extraordinary. They had cracked the code of survival so thoroughly that they dominated the planet for nearly 2 million years. 2 million years. Let that settle in your mind for a moment. If human civilization started tomorrow, it would need to repeat itself over and over again 400 times to match what Homo erectus accomplished. They were the first humans to leave Africa, the first to master fire consistently, and the first to spread across 2 entire continents. While we modern humans have only been around for about 300,000 years, Homo erectus was already ancient when our species first appeared. What made them so successful? They had discovered the secret of standardization. Across thousands of miles, from the savannas of Africa to the forests of Indonesia, Homo erectus made nearly identical stone tools. It's like McDonald's keeping the same recipe whether you're in Tokyo or Tennessee. These weren't simple rocks with sharp edges. They were carefully crafted hand axes, shaped with dozens of precise strikes, each one following the same mental template. Scientists call this the Acheulean tradition, and it represents something remarkable. It means that Homo erectus had developed not just the ability to make tools, but the ability to teach others exactly how to make those same tools, generation after generation. Think about what this actually means. A Homo erectus living in what is now Turkey could pick up a hand axe made by someone in Kenya and immediately know how to use it. The proportions, the balance, the cutting edge, everything would be exactly what they expected. This wasn't accident. This was cultural transmission on a scale that no previous human species had achieved. Their mastery of fire was equally impressive. While earlier humans might have occasionally captured fire from lightning strikes or volcanic activity, Homo erectus were the first to truly control it. They could start fires when they needed them, maintain them through harsh weather, and carry glowing embers for days as they traveled. Fire meant they could live in colder climates, cook food to extract more nutrition, extend their active hours into the night, and protect themselves from dangerous predators. In essence, fire gave them a portable piece of home wherever they went. Their bodies told the story of their success. Homo erectus had long legs built for covering vast distances, just like ours. They had relatively small teeth, suggesting they were cooking their food over controlled fires. They had the modern human proportions that we recognize today, but with thicker bones and more robust muscles. They were built to last, and last they did. Archaeological evidence shows they could heal from serious injuries and live to old age, something that suggests they took care of each other during times of vulnerability. But here's what's truly remarkable about Homo erectus. They didn't just survive in one place. They adapted to frozen steppes in Georgia, where winter temperatures plummeted below anything their African ancestors had experienced. They thrived on tropical islands in Indonesia, learning to navigate between landmasses and exploit marine resources. They established populations everywhere from the Caucasus Mountains to the islands of Southeast Asia. They were the ultimate generalists, able to thrive wherever they found themselves. Some scientists believe they were the first humans to build intentional shelters, creating structures that could protect them from the worst weather. They were definitely the first to hunt large game cooperatively, working together to bring down animals much larger than themselves. And they were certainly the first to carry fire with them as they traveled, maintaining the spark of civilization as they spread across continents. Yet for all their success, for all their achievements, Homo erectus eventually disappeared. They had ruled the world longer than any human species before or since, but they couldn't survive what came next. The question that haunts archaeologists is simple. If Homo erectus was so successful for so long, what could possibly have replaced them? The answer, at least in Europe, was a species that seemed designed by evolution specifically to make us look inadequate. The Neanderthals weren't just another type of human. They were built like the premium model of humanity, with upgrades in every department that mattered for survival. Let's start with their brains. The average Neanderthal brain was 1640 cubic centimeters. The average modern human brain is 1,350 cubic centimeters. They had nearly 300 cubic centimeters more brain tissue than we do. To put that in perspective, that's about the size of a tennis ball worth of extra brain power. It's like they had the premium subscription to intelligence while we were stuck with the basic package. And it wasn't just bigger, it was organized differently. The visual processing centers in their brains were enlarged, giving them what scientists believe was superior night vision. While we stumbled around in the dark, Neanderthals could see clearly in conditions that would leave us completely blind. Their bodies were equally impressive. Imagine taking a modern human and redesigning them specifically for survival in the harshest conditions imaginable. That's essentially what evolution did with Neanderthals. They had barrel chests that housed lungs with a capacity of over 9 liters, compared to our 6 liters. Every breath they took brought in 50% more oxygen than ours. Their hearts were larger, pumping more blood through their robust frames. Their bones were thicker, their muscles more powerful, their entire skeletal structure designed to withstand incredible stress. The muscle attachment sites on Neanderthal bones were 25% larger than ours, indicating strength that would put modern powerlifters to shame. Their forearms were so robust that they could probably arm wrestle a gorilla and have a fighting chance. But this wasn't just brute strength. This was functional power, built for survival in a world where weakness meant death. If Neanderthals were alive today, they'd probably dominate every survival reality show ever made. They could see in near darkness, hold their breath longer than pearl divers, generate body heat in conditions that would give us hypothermia, and maintain that heat with a metabolism that burned calories like a high-performance engine. They were literally built for the Ice Age. But the Neanderthals weren't just physically superior. They had been perfecting their way of life for 400,000 years before we modern humans ever set foot in Europe. 400,000 years of learning every cave, every seasonal migration route, every place where flint could be found. They knew which plants were safe to eat in spring and which ones turned poisonous in fall. They understood the migration patterns of every animal in their territory. They had cultural knowledge that had been refined and passed down through more than 15,000 generations. They had developed the Levallois technique, a sophisticated method of stone tool production that required incredible foresight and planning. Unlike earlier humans who simply struck stones together until something sharp emerged, Neanderthals had to visualize the final tool before they even began striking the stone. They would carefully prepare the stone core, striking it in precise sequences to create the exact shape they wanted. It was like sculptors who could see the finished statue inside a block of marble. Evidence shows they cared for their sick and injured with a tenderness that rivals our own. Skeletons show healed bone fractures that would have taken months of care to recover from. Some Neanderthal remains show evidence of disabilities that would have required constant assistance from the group. These weren't people who abandoned their weak. They were people who understood that survival meant taking care of each other. They buried their dead with what appears to be ceremony. They used pigments to create art on cave walls, mixing ochre and other minerals to create colors that would last for thousands of years. They made jewelry from shells and animal teeth, sometimes carrying these decorative items for hundreds of miles from where they were originally found. They had controlled fire for hundreds of thousands of years, creating hearths that could be lit and maintained through the harshest winters. Some scientists believe they even had a form of language, though it may have been different from ours. Their hyoid bones, which support the voice box, were virtually identical to ours. They had the physical equipment for speech, and their sophisticated tool-making suggests they had the mental complexity to support symbolic communication. The Neanderthals had survived multiple ice ages, thriving in conditions that would kill most modern humans within hours. They were the undisputed masters of Europe, perfectly adapted to their environment, with hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and cultural traditions. When the first modern humans arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago, they weren't entering an empty continent. They were invading the homeland of a species that had every advantage and had earned their place through hundreds of millennia of successful survival. If the Neanderthals were the kings of Europe, then the Denisovans were the mysterious masters of Asia's most challenging environments. We know less about them than we'd like, but what we do know is fascinating and somewhat unsettling. The Denisovans seem to have been the ultimate survivors, thriving in places where even we struggle to survive today. Most of what we know about Denisovans comes from a single cave in Siberia's Altai Mountains. The Denisova Cave sits at high altitude in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Winters there are brutal, with temperatures dropping far below freezing for months at a time. The air is thin, making every breath an effort. It's the kind of place where modern humans need specialized equipment just to visit safely. Yet, archaeological evidence shows that Denisovans not only survived in this harsh environment, they thrived there for thousands of years. Imagine trying to make a living in a place where the growing season lasts only a few months, where game animals migrate hundreds of miles seasonally, and where a single mistake in preparing for winter could mean death for your entire family. The Denisovans didn't just survive these conditions, they made them home. They developed technologies and strategies that allowed them to flourish in environments that would challenge even modern humans with all our advanced gear. Their genetic legacy tells us something remarkable about their capabilities. Modern people in Tibet, Papua New Guinea, and Australia carry Denisovan DNA, sometimes as much as 5% of their total genome. But it's not just any Denisovan DNA. It's specifically the genes that help survive in extreme environments. Tibetans have Denisovan genes that help them process oxygen more efficiently at high altitudes, allowing them to live comfortably at elevations where most people would suffer from altitude sickness. People in Papua New Guinea have Denisovan immune system genes that help them fight off tropical diseases that would devastate populations without this protection. It's like the Denisovans had developed a whole toolkit of genetic solutions for extreme living, and they were generous enough to share those solutions with anyone they encountered. These weren't just random genetic variations. These were sophisticated biological adaptations that took thousands of years to develop and refine. The tools found in Denisova Cave suggest a sophisticated culture that rivals anything their contemporaries were producing. They made jewelry from animal teeth and shells, working with materials that required considerable skill to shape and perforate. They created beads so small and precisely made that archaeologists need magnifying glasses to appreciate the craftsmanship. Some of these ornaments were made from materials that had to be transported from hundreds of miles away, suggesting either long-distance travel capabilities or extensive trade networks that connected distant populations. But perhaps most intriguingly, genetic evidence suggests that Denisovans were more genetically diverse than either Neanderthals or modern humans. This means they had larger populations spread across wider territories. They weren't just a small group eking out survival in a cave. They were a successful species with multiple populations across Asia, each adapted to their local environment. Some lived in the mountains of Siberia, others in the tropical forests of Southeast Asia, still others in the highlands of what is now Tibet. We also know that Denisovans were successful enough to interbreed with multiple other human species. They mated with Neanderthals, producing hybrid offspring like Denny, whose remains were found in Denisova Cave and whose mother was Neanderthal while her father was Denisovan. They mated with early modern humans, passing on genes that still help people today. They may have even mated with other, more archaic human species that we haven't identified yet, contributing to a complex web of genetic exchange across ancient Asia. This level of genetic mixing suggests that Denisovans weren't isolated mountain dwellers. They were part of a complex network of human populations across Asia, interacting and sharing genes with whoever they encountered. They were cosmopolitan in a way, connected to the broader human world even while mastering some of its most challenging environments. The mystery of the Denisovans is that they were clearly successful, clearly sophisticated, and clearly well adapted to their environments. They had the genetic diversity that suggests large populations, the technological sophistication that indicates advanced culture, and the environmental adaptations that allowed them to thrive where others couldn't. Yet, like all the other human species, they eventually disappeared, leaving behind only traces of their DNA in our genomes and a few precious artifacts in a Siberian cave. So here's the situation our ancestors faced when they first began expanding beyond Africa. Homo erectus had already claimed the best territories and had nearly 2 million years of experience. Neanderthals were physically superior in almost every measurable way and had hundreds of thousands of years of European expertise. Denisovans were masters of Asia's most challenging environments and had the genetic diversity that suggested large, successful populations. And what did we have? We were the newcomers, the late arrivals to a world that had already been divided up by species that seemed better equipped for survival than we were. We had smaller brains than Neanderthals. We had weaker bodies than both Neanderthals and the robust Homo erectus populations. We had no experience with the climates and challenges of Europe or Asia. We were, by any reasonable measure, the underdogs. It's like showing up to a job interview where the other candidates have been working in the industry for hundreds of thousands of years, have superior qualifications in every category, and know all the right people. On paper, we didn't stand a chance. Our populations were small when we first left Africa. Genetic studies suggest that all non-African human populations descended from a founding group of perhaps only a few thousand individuals. This means we had limited genetic diversity compared to the established human species we would encounter. We were like a small startup trying to compete with companies that had been dominating their markets for hundreds of thousands of years. Except the stakes weren't market share, they were survival itself. The archaeological record from our early expansion attempts is spotty and often disappointing. Our first ventures into the Middle East seem to have failed repeatedly. We'd establish small populations, survive for a few thousand years, then disappear, leaving behind only scattered stone tools and the occasional bone fragment. It's as if we kept trying to establish beachheads in hostile territory, only to be pushed back again and again by forces we couldn't overcome. The established human species, meanwhile, continued their successful ways of life, apparently untroubled by our brief appearances. Neanderthals continued to thrive in Europe, their populations stable and their territories secure. Denisovans maintained their mountain strongholds across Asia. Homo erectus populations persisted in their long-established territories. From their perspective, we probably looked like a minor nuisance, a small and fragile species that occasionally showed up, struggled for a while, then faded away. Even our technological advantages weren't obvious at first. Yes, we made more diverse tools than Neanderthals, but their tools were more robust and better suited to their environments. A Neanderthal spear point could punch through the thick hide of a mammoth and still be sharp enough to use again. Our more delicate tools might have been more versatile, but versatility doesn't matter much when you're facing down a charging aurochs. Yes, we had more sophisticated hunting techniques, but they had been successfully hunting the same prey for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew exactly when the reindeer would migrate, where the cave bears would hibernate, which valleys would provide shelter during the worst storms. Their knowledge was deep, tested, and proven. Our innovations were untested theories against their time-tested wisdom. Yes, we seemed to have more complex social behaviors, but they had proven social systems that had sustained them through multiple ice ages. Neanderthal groups might have been smaller than ours, but they were stable, cohesive, and effective. They had survived the worst that Europe could throw at them. Why would they need to chain? From the perspective of any neutral observer watching Earth 50,000 years ago, betting on modern humans would have seemed like a poor choice. We were smaller, weaker, less experienced, and less adapted to the environments we were trying to enter. We were going up against species that had every advantage and had proven their success over vast periods of time. We were the biological equivalent of David facing multiple Goliaths, except we didn't even have a slingshot. The early fossil record seems to support this pessimistic assessment. For every successful modern human settlement archaeologists have found from our early expansion period, they've found evidence of several failed attempts. We were clearly struggling, clearly outmatched, clearly fighting an uphill battle against opponents who had every reason to be confident in their superiority. Yet somehow, we're the ones who survived. Somehow, we're the ones who inherited the Earth. The question that haunts anthropologists and archaeologists isn't why the other human species failed. The question is how we succeeded when everything seemed stacked against us. What did we have that the others lacked? What advantage could possibly overcome the superiority of our competitors? The answer, as we'll discover, wasn't in our bodies or our brains or our tools. It was in something far more subtle and far more powerful, something that wouldn't become apparent until it was too late for our rivals to adapt. Something that would change not just the course of human evolution, but the entire trajectory of life on Earth. To truly understand how remarkable our survival was, we need to appreciate just how thoroughly the Neanderthals had us outmatched in almost every physical category. This wasn't a case of slight advantages or marginal differences. The Neanderthals were built like the result of a million-year engineering project specifically designed to create the perfect Ice Age human. Let's start with their strength, because the numbers are genuinely staggering. The muscle attachment sites on Neanderthal bones were 25% larger than ours. These aren't just slightly bigger bumps and ridges on their bones. These are massive, robust attachment points that indicate muscles capable of generating forces that would put modern professional athletes to shame. To put this in perspective, imagine if every Neanderthal had the upper body strength of a heavyweight boxer and the grip strength of a rock climber. And that was just their baseline normal. Their forearms in particular were extraordinary. The bones were so thick and the muscle attachments so pronounced that some scientists joke they could have arm-wrestled bears and had a reasonable chance of winning. But this wasn't just about brute force. This was functional strength designed for the daily activities that kept them alive. Throwing spears with enough force to penetrate mammoth hide, wielding stone tools for hours without fatigue, carrying heavy loads across difficult terrain. Their skeletal structure tells a story of incredible durability. Neanderthal bones were significantly thicker than ours, with a bone density that would make them almost impossible to break. Modern humans can suffer stress fractures from repetitive activities or break bones in falls that a Neanderthal would shrug off. Their skulls in particular were built like fortresses, with bone thickness that was sometimes double ours. This wasn't just protection for their larger brains. This was armor designed for a life where head injuries were a constant risk. The architecture of their bodies was perfectly suited to their environment. Their wider pelvises weren't just for birthing those larger-brained babies, though that was certainly important. The wider pelvis also provided a more stable platform for the massive muscles of their core and legs. Combined with their shorter limbs, this gave them a lower center of gravity that would have made them incredibly stable on uneven terrain and during physical confrontations. But perhaps most impressive was their cardiovascular system. Those barrel chests weren't just for show. They housed hearts that were larger than ours, pumping more blood with each beat. Combined with their expanded lung capacity, this meant that every cell in their bodies received more oxygen than ours do. They could sustain high levels of physical activity for longer periods without fatigue. In a world where stamina often meant the difference between successful hunting and starvation, this was a massive advantage. Their metabolism was equally remarkable. Neanderthals burned calories at a rate that would be considered hyperactive by our standards. This wasn't inefficiency, it was adaptation. Their bodies were essentially high-performance engines, capable of generating enormous amounts of energy when needed. This allowed them to maintain their body temperature in conditions that would give us hypothermia, to fuel their powerful muscles during extended hunts, and to recover quickly from physical exertion. Even their sensory capabilities were enhanced beyond ours. Those enlarged visual processing centers in their brains weren't just bigger for the sake of being bigger. They were connected to eyes that could gather more light and process visual information more efficiently than ours. In the long, dark winters of Ice Age Europe, when the sun barely rose above the horizon, This enhanced night vision would have been literally a matter of life and death. The cumulative effect of all these physical advantages is almost overwhelming to consider. The Neanderthals weren't just slightly better adapted to their environment than we were. They were so thoroughly superior in almost every measurable physical category that our survival seems to defy biological logic. They were stronger, tougher, better adapted to cold, capable of seeing in conditions that would leave us blind, and equipped with cardiovascular systems that made ours look like economy models. If you could take a time machine back 50,000 years and watch Neanderthals and early modern humans competing for the same resources, it would be like watching a heavyweight champion fight a teenage amateur. The outcome should have been obvious from the start, but the Neanderthals' advantages extended far beyond their impressive physical capabilities. They had spent hundreds of thousands of years developing technologies and social systems that were perfectly adapted to their world. While we were still figuring out the basics of survival outside Africa, they had already mastered the art of thriving in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. Their stone tool technology was sophisticated in ways that took archaeologists decades to fully appreciate. The Levallois technique that Neanderthals perfected requires a level of planning and spatial reasoning that rivals anything modern humans were doing at the time. To create a Levallois tool, you have to start with a carefully selected piece of stone, then spend considerable time preparing its surface with precise strikes. Only then can you deliver the final blow that removes the finished tool. It's like a surgeon planning an operation, visualizing every step before making the first incision. Neanderthals created composite tools that required multiple components and sophisticated assembly. They would carefully shape wooden handles, bind them to stone points with plant fibers or animal sinew, and waterproof the bindings with tree resins. These weren't crude spear throwers. These were precision instruments that required knowledge of materials science and engineering principles. Some of their tools were so specialized that archaeologists are still figuring out what they were used for. It's like finding a medieval craftsman's workshop, complete with specialized tools for every conceivable task. They created tiny stone points for specific tasks, scrapers with precisely angled edges for different types of hide preparation, and cutting tools with blade geometries that maximized efficiency. Their mastery of fire was equally impressive. Neanderthals weren't just using fire, they were engineering it. They built hearths with sophisticated airflow systems that could maintain consistent temperatures for days. They knew which types of wood produced the best coals for cooking, which ones created the least smoke for indoor use, and which ones burned hottest for tool making. They could start fires in wet conditions that would challenge modern camping enthusiasts. Archaeological evidence shows they were using fire for advanced purposes beyond warmth and cooking. They used it to treat stone tools, heating flint to precise temperatures to improve its knapping properties. They used controlled burns to modify their environment, creating clearings that would attract game animals. Most remarkably, they used fire to extract birch tar, a natural adhesive that required heating birch bark in controlled, oxygen-free conditions. This isn't something you figure out by accident. This is sophisticated chemical engineering. Their social organization was complex and caring in ways that challenge stereotypes about brutish cave people. Neanderthal sites consistently show evidence of extended care for disabled and injured individuals. We find skeletons with healed fractures that would have required months of careful nursing to recover from. One of the most moving discoveries is the skeleton of an elderly Neanderthal man from Shanidar Cave in Iraq. He had suffered multiple serious injuries throughout his life, including a crushed arm, a damaged eye, and a leg injury that would have left him with a severe limp. Yet he lived to be quite old for his time, which means his community continued to care for him long after he was able to contribute to their survival. This wasn't just occasional kindness. This was a social system built around caring for community members regardless of their productivity. They were also artists and innovators in ways that only recently have been fully recognized. Neanderthal cave paintings in Spain date to over 65,000 years ago, making them older than any cave art attributed to modern humans. They created jewelry from shells and animal teeth, sometimes transporting these materials over hundreds of miles. They used pigments to create body paint and to decorate their tools and living spaces. Perhaps most remarkably, they had symbolic burial practices. Neanderthal burials show clear evidence of intentional positioning of bodies, inclusion of tools and other objects, and sometimes even what might have been flower arrangements. Recent evidence strongly suggests they engaged in complex burial rituals that indicate abstract thinking about death and perhaps even afterlife beliefs. The true measure of Neanderthal success wasn't just their impressive bodies or sophisticated tools. It was their mastery of environments that would kill most modern humans within days. They had turned the Ice Age world of Europe into their personal domain, understanding its rhythms and challenges with an intimacy that came from hundreds of thousands of years of experience. Consider what Ice Age Europe was actually like. This wasn't just a slightly colder version of the modern world. This was a landscape dominated by massive glaciers, where temperatures could drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and stay there for months, where blizzards could last for weeks, burying entire valleys under snow. It's the kind of environment where modern humans, even with all our technology, require specialized equipment just to survive for short periods. Yet the Neanderthals didn't just survive in these conditions, they thrived. They developed hunting strategies specifically adapted to Ice Age prey. They knew exactly when and where to find mammoth herds, understanding migration patterns that played out over hundreds of miles and multiple seasons. They could predict when reindeer would move through specific mountain passes, positioning themselves days in advance to intercept herds during crucial migration periods. Their knowledge of cave bear behavior was particularly impressive. Cave bears were massive creatures, significantly larger than modern grizzly bears, and they competed with Neanderthals for the best cave sites. Rather than simply avoiding these dangerous animals, Neanderthals developed sophisticated strategies for displacing them, knowing when bears would be in deep hibernation and most vulnerable. The seasonal round of Neanderthal life was precisely calibrated to their environment. They knew which plants were available in early spring before game animals returned from their winter ranges. They understood which nuts and berries would provide crucial calories during the lean times of late winter. They had identified dozens of different plant medicines, using willow bark for pain relief and yarrow for wound healing. This wasn't folk wisdom from a few generations. This was a sophisticated pharmacopoeia developed over hundreds of thousands of years. Their shelter construction was equally advanced. Neanderthal sites show evidence of sophisticated structures designed for long-term occupation. They built hearths with complex ventilation systems that could heat large spaces efficiently while removing smoke. They created storage areas for food and tools, organizing their living spaces in ways that maximized both comfort and functionality. Perhaps most remarkably, they had developed what we might recognize as weather prediction capabilities. Neanderthal sites often show evidence of preparation for severe weather events. with large quantities of food stored and tools prepared well in advance of seasonal changes. They understood the subtle environmental cues that indicated when harsh weather was approaching, knowledge that could mean the difference between survival and death. Their understanding extended to the geological features of their landscape. They knew where to find the best stone for tool making, sometimes traveling considerable distances to quarries that produced superior materials. They understood which caves would remain dry during spring floods and which valleys would provide shelter from the worst winds. The Neanderthals had also mastered resource management in ways that ensured long-term sustainability. They understood seasonal limitations and planned their activities accordingly, practicing what we would now recognize as rotational harvesting of plant resources to ensure important food sources would be available year after year. By the time modern humans arrived in Europe, the Neanderthals possessed what amounted to a complete manual for survival in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Every generation had added to this store of wisdom, refining techniques and developing better strategies for dealing with environmental challenges. They weren't just surviving in Ice Age Europe. They were thriving in ways that made it seem like they had been specifically designed for that environment. So if the Neanderthals were so perfectly adapted, so physically superior, and so environmentally savvy, how did we possibly compete with them? The answer lies in something that wouldn't have been obvious to any observer at the time. It was hidden in the way we organized our social lives, in the size and structure of our communities, and in our ability to maintain relationships with far more people than any other human species had ever managed. Scientists call this concept Dunbar's number, named after British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who discovered that there's a relationship between brain size and the number of stable social relationships a species can maintain. For most primates, this number is quite small. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, can maintain stable relationships with about 15 to 20 individuals. Neanderthals, despite their larger brains, seem to have been limited to groups of roughly 5 to 15 individuals. But modern humans, we broke the mold entirely. We can maintain stable, meaningful relationships with up to 150 people. That might not sound revolutionary until you consider what this actually means in practical terms. A typical Neanderthal group might know intimately about 10 people. A typical human group could know intimately 15 times that many. Think about your own life for a moment. You probably have a core group of family and close friends, maybe 10 or 20 people you're really close to. But then there's a much larger circle of people you know well enough to trust, to trade favors with, to rely on in a crisis. Coworkers, neighbors, distant relatives, friends of friends. People whose names you remember, whose personalities you understand, whose help you could count on if needed. That's Dunbar's number in action, and it's uniquely human. This difference created a cascade of advantages that weren't immediately obvious, but became overwhelming over time. When a Neanderthal group encountered a problem they couldn't solve, they had maybe 10 or 15 minds to work on it. When a human group encountered the same problem, they had potential access to 150 minds, each with their own experiences, knowledge, and insights. But the advantages went far beyond problem solving. Consider what happens during a crisis. If disease, accident, or predation reduced a Neanderthal group from 10 members to 5, they'd lost half their knowledge base, half their working capacity, half their genetic diversity. If the same disaster reduced a human group from 50 to 25, they'd still have more functional members than the original Neanderthal group had started with. The math of survival becomes very different when you're working with larger numbers. Human groups could afford to take risks that would be suicidal for smaller groups. They could send out multiple hunting parties simultaneously, knowing that if one failed, others might succeed. They could split up during migrations, with some groups exploring new territories while others maintained established camps. They could specialize in ways that smaller groups never could, with some individuals becoming expert hunters, others expert tool makers, still others expert healers. This social revolution also created what we might recognize as the first information networks. While a Neanderthal group might know about the resources and conditions within a day's walk of their territory, human groups could access information from much wider areas. If someone in your extended network had traveled to distant mountains and found good hunting there, that information would eventually make its way back to you. If another group had discovered a new type of stone that made better tools, that knowledge would spread through social connections. The reproductive advantages were equally significant. Neanderthal groups were so small that finding suitable mates often meant long, dangerous journeys to locate other groups. Human groups were large enough that suitable partners were usually available within the extended social network. This meant less time spent on dangerous mate-seeking expeditions and more genetic diversity within populations. Perhaps most importantly, larger social groups provided something that scientists call buffering against environmental stress. When resources became scarce in one area, human groups could call on their extended networks for help. They could temporarily split up and disperse to areas where distant allies had reported better conditions. They could pool resources across multiple territories, ensuring that no single group faced starvation while others had plenty. The Neanderthals, for all their individual superiority, were trapped by the mathematics of small group living. Each group was essentially on its own, forced to solve every problem with limited resources and manpower. They were like individual craftsmen competing against an entire factory system. As individuals, they might be more skilled than any single factory worker, but they couldn't match the collective output and resilience of the larger operation. But the social revolution was just the beginning. Humans had developed something that no other species had ever managed: the ability to maintain economic relationships across vast distances with people they might never meet. We had invented trade networks that spanned continents, creating advantages that multiplied far beyond what our larger social groups alone could provide. The archaeological evidence for this revolution comes from places like Olorgesailie in Kenya, where scientists have found tools and materials that tell an extraordinary story. About 320,000 years ago, long before we ever encountered Neanderthals or left Africa, humans were already engaged in long-distance trade that would have been impossible for any other species. At Olorgesailie, archaeologists have found obsidian tools made from volcanic glass that came from sources over 60 kilometers away. 60 kilometers is a several-day journey on foot through potentially dangerous territory. But the obsidian tools are just the beginning. The site also contains pigments that came from distant lake beds, materials that were clearly valued for symbolic rather than purely practical purposes. Think about what this actually required. It meant that humans had developed concepts of value and exchange that extended far beyond immediate family groups. It meant they could trust strangers enough to engage in transactions, and had communication systems sophisticated enough to negotiate trades for materials that might not be immediately available. This trade revolution created resilience that went far beyond what individual groups could achieve. If local stone sources produced inferior tools, human groups could trade for better materials from distant quarries. If local food sources failed, They could exchange surplus materials for resources from areas that were currently more productive. They had created what economists would recognize as the first risk diversification systems. The contrast with Neanderthals is striking. Neanderthal tools are almost always made from local materials, usually found within a day's walk of where they were used. This isn't because Neanderthals couldn't travel long distances. It's because they hadn't developed the social technologies that would make long-distance trade beneficial and sustainable. Imagine being a Neanderthal group that had found an excellent quarry for stone tools. That quarry would benefit your group, and maybe occasionally you might share some tools with allied groups nearby. But you wouldn't have the social systems to turn that quarry into a trade center that could benefit dozens of groups across hundreds of kilometers. Humans, on the other hand, had developed exactly these capabilities. A good resource discovery could benefit not just the local group, but entire networks of allied communities. Information about resources, techniques, and innovations could spread across continents, limited only by the speed of human travel and the extent of social connections. This trade revolution also accelerated innovation in ways that smaller, isolated groups could never match. When you're part of a continental trade network, a useful innovation can spread to thousands of people within a few generations. The feedback and refinement that comes from widespread adoption can turn a simple innovation into a sophisticated technology remarkably quickly. The long-distance trade networks also created the first truly portable wealth. While Neanderthals might accumulate useful materials in their territories, humans were developing materials and objects that had value precisely because they could be moved and exchanged. Shells from distant coasts, rare stones from specific quarries, specially prepared pigments. These weren't just useful objects, they were currency that could be converted into other types of value when needed. By the time humans encountered Neanderthals in Europe, we weren't just individual groups competing for resources. We were representatives of vast networks that spanned continents, with access to materials, information, and innovations from across the known world. The foundation that made both larger social groups and long-distance trade possible was perhaps the most revolutionary development in the history of life on Earth: the emergence of fully modern language. Not just simple communication, which many species possess, but the kind of infinitely flexible, recursive language that could encode abstract concepts, future plans, and complex cultural knowledge. While Neanderthals almost certainly had some form of communication, and possibly even a type of language, the evidence suggests that human language had developed capabilities that went far beyond anything our relatives had achieved. We had created what amounts to a technology for transmitting thoughts directly from one mind to another, with a precision and complexity that no other species has ever matched. Consider what fully modern language actually allows you to do. You can describe events that happened in the past with enough detail that someone else can learn from your experiences. You can explain plans for future activities complex enough to require coordination among dozens of people. You can teach abstract concepts that have no physical referent, like justice, mathematics, or kinship obligations. Most remarkably, you can embed ideas within ideas, creating layered meanings that can encode vast amounts of information in relatively short communications. This wasn't just an improvement in communication. This was the emergence of a new type of information storage and transmission system. Human language could serve as external memory, allowing groups to maintain cultural knowledge that was far too complex for any individual to remember completely. It could serve as a coordination mechanism for large groups working on complex projects. It could serve as a teaching system, allowing innovations to be transmitted across generations with minimal loss of detail. Human language made possible what scientists call cumulative cultural evolution. Each generation could not only learn from the previous generation, but could add to that knowledge and pass on an enhanced version to their children. A Neanderthal child might learn to make the same tools their parents made, but a human child could learn not just how to make existing tools, but why those tools worked, what alternatives had been tried, and how the design might be improved. This created an accelerating feedback loop of innovation that no other species has ever achieved. While Neanderthal tool technology remained essentially stable for hundreds of thousands of years, human technology was changing and improving within generations. We were essentially running cultural software on biological hardware, and that software was updating itself constantly. Language also enabled the development of abstract social concepts that made large group coordination possible. Concepts like reciprocal obligation, delayed gratification, and reputation management could be discussed, refined, and passed on as cultural knowledge. These abstract ideas became the foundation for the kind of extended cooperation that allowed human groups to grow far beyond the limits that constrained other species. Perhaps most importantly, language allowed humans to engage in scenario planning. Groups could discuss potential futures, plan responses to various contingencies, and coordinate complex strategies that might take months or years to implement. They could share detailed information about distant territories and seasonal patterns that would allow other groups to make informed decisions about migrations and resource management. The storytelling capabilities that came with advanced language created something entirely new: professional knowledge keepers. Human groups could designate individuals whose primary responsibility was to maintain and transmit cultural memory. These weren't just people who remembered a few useful techniques. These were living libraries who could store vast amounts of cultural knowledge and pass it on with remarkable accuracy. It's like having access to the internet, while your competitors are limited to whatever they can remember personally. The amount of information available to any human group was essentially unlimited, bounded only by the extent of their social networks and the sophistication of their language capabilities. The combination of larger social groups, long-distance trade, and advanced language created something unprecedented in the natural world. Innovation networks that could generate, refine, and spread new ideas faster than any single group could develop them alone. Humans had essentially created the first research and development system distributed across continents and operating continuously across generations. Consider how innovation actually works. An individual might have a good idea, but turning that idea into a practical solution usually requires testing, refinement, and adaptation to different circumstances. In a small, isolated group, this process is slow and limited. Human innovation networks worked completely differently. When someone developed a useful new technique, it would spread through trade relationships and social connections to dozens of other groups. Each group would test the innovation in their own environment, discover what worked and what didn't, and potentially develop improvements. It's like the difference between a single person trying to solve a problem and having access to a global community of experts who can collaborate on solutions. The collective brain power, diverse experiences, and accumulated knowledge of the network could tackle challenges that would be impossible for any individual group to solve alone. This distributed innovation system also created redundancy that made human culture remarkably resilient. If one group developed a crucial technique and then disappeared due to disease or environmental disaster, that knowledge wasn't lost forever. It had already spread to other groups through the network, and it would continue to spread and evolve even after the original innovators were gone. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of this innovation acceleration. Human tool technology, art, and social organization began evolving much more rapidly than any previous human species had achieved. New techniques would appear in one region and then show up in sites hundreds of kilometers away within a few generations. Ideas were spreading faster than people could migrate. This innovation system also enabled specialization at a scale that smaller groups couldn't achieve. Instead of every group needing to master every survival skill, different communities could focus on what they did best and trade their specialties through the network. Some groups became expert toolmakers, others master hunters, still others specialists in particular types of resource processing. The benefits of specialization were enormous. When everyone in a small group has to be generalists, no one can become truly expert at anything. But when groups can specialize and trade their expertise, each community can develop techniques and knowledge that are far more sophisticated than any generalist could achieve. Human innovation networks also created the first system for preserving and transmitting complex knowledge across generations. Unlike genetic evolution, which takes thousands of years to produce significant changes, cultural evolution could adapt to new challenges within decades or even years. When environments changed or new resources became available, human groups could develop and share new techniques fast enough to track those changes. This adaptive speed gave humans an enormous advantage over species that relied primarily on genetic adaptation. When climate conditions shifted or new territories became available, humans could respond with behavioral and technological innovations that allowed them to thrive in situations that would have been impossible for their ancestors. Perhaps most importantly, these networks created what scientists call cultural ratcheting. Unlike individual learning, which can be lost when individuals die, cultural learning could accumulate across generations. Each generation could build on the innovations of previous generations, creating an ever-growing store of knowledge that made human groups more capable over time. By the time humans encountered other human species outside Africa, we weren't just individuals competing for resources. We were the end products of a continental innovation system that had been refining human capabilities for thousands of years. We were carrying not just our own knowledge and skills, but the accumulated innovations of countless communities connected through the most sophisticated information network that had ever existed on Earth. While our social and technological advantages were impressive, they might not have been enough on their own to overcome the physical superiority of our rivals. But humans carried with us a hidden weapon that wouldn't become apparent until we began interacting closely with other human species. We had been forged in what amounts to the world's most challenging disease laboratory, and we were carrying a biological arsenal that our competitors had never encountered. Africa, then as now, was the global hotspot for infectious diseases. The combination of tropical climate, dense forests, and close contact with a diverse array of wild animals had created an environment where pathogens evolved rapidly and spread efficiently. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors had been locked in an evolutionary arms race with some of the most sophisticated disease-causing organisms on Earth. This wasn't a pleasant process. Wave after wave of epidemics had swept through early human populations, each one killing the most vulnerable and leaving only those with the genetic resistance to survive and reproduce. Over time, this brutal selection process had created human populations with immune systems that were essentially hardened against a vast array of tropical diseases. Think about what this means in practical terms. When humans encountered malaria, sleeping sickness, yellow fever, and dozens of other tropical diseases, some individuals survived and passed on their resistance genes. When we encountered bacterial infections, viral outbreaks, and parasitic diseases that would devastate populations with no previous exposure, our ancestors developed genetic defenses that could be inherited by their children. By the time humans began expanding beyond Africa, we were carrying genetic resistance to diseases that existed nowhere else on Earth. Our immune systems had been trained by the world's most challenging pathogens, and we had developed defenses that our relatives in Europe and Asia had never needed to evolve. The mathematical models that scientists have developed to understand disease transmission help explain why this gave us such a devastating advantage. When two populations with different disease histories come into contact, the group with broader disease resistance has an enormous advantage over the group with more limited experience. It's like the difference between someone who grew up in a house with 5 older siblings, constantly exposed to every cold and flu that made the rounds at school, versus someone who grew up as an only child in a very clean environment. When they meet, the person with broader exposure is much more likely to remain healthy while the other person gets sick. But the advantages went beyond just individual resistance. Human populations had also evolved cultural practices that helped limit disease transmission. We had developed taboos around contaminated food and water, burial practices that reduced the spread of disease from corpses, and social behaviors that isolated sick individuals during the most contagious phases of illness. The archaeological evidence suggests that this disease advantage may have been one of the deciding factors in human expansion. Sites that show evidence of contact between humans and other human species often also show signs of population decline among the non-human groups. Not the kind of sudden decline you'd expect from warfare, but the gradual decline that's characteristic of populations dealing with new diseases they have no resistance to. This wasn't intentional biological warfare. Early humans had no understanding of disease transmission or germ theory. They were simply carrying with them the invisible passengers that had co-evolved with them over hundreds of thousands of years in Africa. When they encountered populations that had never been exposed to these pathogens, the results were predictably devastating. The Stanford University disease transmission models suggest that even a small advantage in disease resistance could have enormous effects over time. If human populations experienced 10% lower mortality rates from infectious diseases, that advantage would compound over generations, leading to dramatically different population sizes within just a few thousand years. This disease advantage also created a positive feedback loop that reinforced our other advantages. Populations that were less affected by disease could maintain larger group sizes, which enhanced our social advantages. They could invest more time and energy in innovation and cultural development, rather than simply surviving epidemic outbreaks. They could maintain trade networks and social connections that might otherwise be disrupted by high mortality rates. Perhaps most importantly, our disease resistance gave us staying power in territories where other human species couldn't maintain stable populations. We could establish permanent settlements in areas where our competitors were periodically devastated by disease outbreaks. Over time, this meant that we could claim the best territories and resources, while our rivals were forced into increasingly marginal environments. While disease resistance gave us a biological advantage, our ability to cooperate with non-relatives at unprecedented scales gave us a social advantage that proved equally decisive. Humans had developed something that was virtually unique among primates: the ability to work together effectively with people who shared no family connections, sometimes for extended periods and across considerable distances. Most primate cooperation is limited to close relatives or individuals with whom you have direct, ongoing relationships. Chimpanzees will cooperate with their immediate family members and close allies, but this cooperation breaks down quickly when dealing with strangers. Even Neanderthals, despite their sophisticated culture, seem to have been limited to relatively small, kinship-based groups. Humans somehow broke through these limitations and developed what anthropologists call large-scale cooperation among non-relatives. We could work together with people we just met, coordinate activities across multiple unrelated groups, and maintain cooperative relationships even when the benefits might not be realized for months or years. This wasn't just a matter of being nice to strangers. This was a fundamental revolution in social organization that required the development of entirely new cognitive and cultural capabilities. Humans had to develop concepts of fairness that could apply to people outside their immediate family. They had to create systems of reputation and trust that could operate across multiple communities. Think about what this actually means in practical terms. When a Neanderthal group encountered a resource shortage, they could rely on help from maybe 10 to 15 relatives and close allies. When a human group encountered the same shortage, they could potentially call on assistance from dozens of allied communities, involving hundreds of individuals who might not even know each other personally. The mathematical advantages of this kind of large-scale cooperation are staggering. Human groups could undertake projects that would be impossible for smaller groups. They could organize hunts involving dozens of participants, coordinate migrations across hundreds of kilometers, and pool resources for major construction projects or technological innovations. But perhaps most importantly, large-scale cooperation created resilience against disasters that would devastate smaller groups. If disease or environmental changes reduced a kinship-based group below a certain threshold, that group would simply disappear. Human groups connected to larger cooperative networks could survive disasters that would eliminate isolated communities. This cooperation code also enabled what we might recognize as crisis response networks. When individual communities faced emergencies, the broader network could mobilize resources and assistance far beyond what any single group could provide. Food sharing during famines, tools sharing during resource shortages, knowledge sharing during technological challenges. The development of these cooperative capabilities required sophisticated cultural evolution. Humans had to develop shared concepts of obligation, reciprocity, and fairness that could operate across communities with different traditions. They had to create communication systems that could coordinate complex activities among people who might speak different dialects. Most remarkably, they had to develop delayed reciprocity capabilities. Unlike other species, which generally require immediate returns for cooperative behavior, humans could engage in cooperative activities where the benefits might not be realized for months or years. They could invest time and resources in relationships that might only pay off during future crises. This created what amounts to the first insurance systems in the natural world. By maintaining cooperative relationships with multiple communities across wide geographic areas, human groups were essentially purchasing insurance against local disasters. They were trading current resources and effort for future security and assistance. By the time humans encountered other human species outside Africa, we weren't just carrying individual advantages. We were representatives of cooperative networks that could mobilize resources, knowledge, and assistance on a scale that no other human species had ever achieved. But perhaps the most crucial advantage humans possessed was something that's harder to measure in the archaeological record, but may have been the most important factor of all: unprecedented behavioral flexibility. While other human species had evolved sophisticated adaptations to specific environments, humans had evolved the ability to change their behavior faster than any species in the history of life on Earth. This flexibility operated on multiple timescales, from individual learning that could happen within hours to cultural innovations that could spread through populations within a single generation. Unlike other species, which relied primarily on genetic adaptations that took thousands of years to develop, humans could respond to new challenges with behavioral changes that could be implemented almost immediately. Consider what this means when a population encounters a new environment. A Neanderthal group entering a new territory would rely on genetic adaptations developed over hundreds of thousands of years, plus whatever cultural knowledge they'd inherited from previous generations. If those adaptations weren't well suited to the new environment, they'd have to slowly develop new approaches through trial and error over many generations. A human group entering the same territory could observe local conditions, experiment with new techniques, and develop effective strategies within a few seasons. If local animals had different migration patterns, humans could adjust their hunting strategies accordingly. If local plants required different processing techniques, humans could figure out what worked and share that knowledge with the entire group. This behavioral flexibility was made possible by the same language and cultural capabilities that enabled our other advantages. But it represented something qualitatively different. We weren't just better at sharing information or coordinating activities. We were better at thinking creatively about new problems and developing novel solutions that had never been tried before. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of this flexibility in action. Human technological traditions show rapid innovation and adaptation to local conditions. The same basic human populations would develop completely different toolkits, hunting strategies, and social organizations depending on the environments they encountered. This flexibility also operated at the individual level in ways that were unprecedented among primates. Human individuals could learn complex new skills throughout their entire lifetimes, constantly adapting their behavior to changing circumstances. While other species might learn a few new behaviors during their youth and then maintain those behaviors throughout their adult lives, humans could continue learning and adapting until death. The flexibility advantage was particularly powerful when combined with our social and communication capabilities. When one individual discovered a useful new technique, that innovation could spread to the entire community within days or weeks. When one community developed an effective solution to an environmental challenge, that solution could spread to allied communities across hundreds of kilometers within a few generations. This created what scientists call behavioral evolution that operated much faster than genetic evolution. Instead of waiting thousands of years for genetic adaptations to environmental challenges, human populations could develop behavioral adaptations within decades. This meant that humans could track environmental changes and exploit new opportunities far more quickly than any other species. Perhaps most importantly, this flexibility allowed humans to exploit resources and environments that other species couldn't use effectively. While Neanderthals were superbly adapted to hunting large game in Ice Age Europe, humans could quickly learn to exploit marine resources, develop plant processing techniques, and adapt to changing prey availability. We were generalists in the best sense, capable of thriving in almost any environment we encountered. By the time humans began competing directly with other human species, we weren't just adapted to specific environments. We were adapted to adaptation itself, capable of changing our behavior faster than our competitors could respond to the changes we were making. All of these advantages came together in a crucial testing ground that would determine whether humans could successfully compete with our more established relatives. The Levant, the region that includes modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and parts of Syria and Jordan, became the world's first laboratory for human species competition. For nearly 100,000 years, this region served as a contact zone where different human species encountered each other, competed for resources, and tested their respective survival strategies. The Levant was perfectly positioned to serve this role. It sat at the crossroads between Africa, Europe, and Asia, making it a natural corridor for human migration. It contained diverse environments, from Mediterranean forests to desert margins, providing a range of ecological niches that different species could exploit. Most importantly, it was a region where the territories of different human species overlapped, creating the first sustained contact between modern humans and our relatives. Archaeological evidence shows that this contact zone was active for an extraordinarily long time. Humans appear to have been moving in and out of the Levant for at least 100,000 years, occasionally establishing populations that persisted for thousands of years before disappearing, only to be replaced by new waves of migrants. Sometimes these populations were modern humans, sometimes they were Neanderthals, and sometimes they may have been other human species entirely. This long period of contact and competition created something unprecedented in human evolution, a natural laboratory where different human species could test their survival strategies against each other under varying environmental conditions. When climate conditions favored one type of adaptation, the species with that adaptation would expand into the region. When conditions changed, different species might gain the advantage. The Levant laboratory was crucial for human development because it allowed our ancestors to gradually adapt to non-African environments while still maintaining connections to their African homeland. Unlike the later expansion into Europe and Asia, which required humans to survive in completely unfamiliar environments with no possibility of retreat, the Levant offered a transitional zone where mistakes wouldn't necessarily be fatal. During this 100,000-year testing period, humans were essentially learning how to compete with other human species. We were developing the social, technological, and behavioral adaptations that would eventually allow us to succeed in direct competition with Neanderthals and other human species. We were also engaging in the genetic exchange that would give us access to beneficial adaptations that our relatives had developed. The interbreeding that occurred in the Levant wasn't just a minor side effect of species contact. It was a crucial part of human evolution that allowed us to acquire genetic advantages that we couldn't have developed on our own. When humans interbred with Neanderthals in the Levant, we acquired genetic variants that improved our immune systems, enhanced our cold tolerance, and provided other advantages that would prove crucial for survival in non-African environments. But perhaps most importantly, the Levant laboratory allowed humans to develop what we might call species competition strategies. We learned how to coexist with other human species when necessary, how to compete effectively when resources were scarce, and how to exploit environmental changes that might disadvantage our competitors. The archaeological record from the Levant shows clear evidence of technological and behavioral innovations that emerged during this period of species contact. Human tool technologies became more sophisticated, hunting strategies became more diverse, and social organization became more complex. These weren't random developments. These were adaptations that emerged specifically in response to the challenges of competing with other human species. The long duration of the Levant laboratory also allowed for the gradual accumulation of advantages that might not have been decisive individually, but became overwhelming when combined. Small improvements in social organization, marginal increases in disease resistance, and minor enhancements in behavioral flexibility could accumulate over thousands of years to create decisive advantages. By the time humans finally expanded successfully beyond the Levant into Europe and Asia, we weren't the same species that had first left Africa. We were the products of 100,000 years of testing, refinement, and adaptation, specifically designed to compete with other human species. We had essentially graduated from the world's longest and most challenging course in human species competition. The Levant laboratory had transformed us from a promising but unproven African species into the ultimate human species competitor. Equipped with all the tools necessary to succeed in direct competition with the most successful human species that had ever existed. So our ancestors had cracked the code in the Levant laboratory, developing their triple advantage of cooperation, disease resistance, and flexibility. But here's where the story takes a surprising turn that changes everything we thought we knew about human survival. Picture this: you're swiping through a modern dating app, and you match with someone who seems different but intriguing. Now imagine that person isn't just from another culture, but from an entirely different human species. That's essentially what happened to our ancestors, and the consequences of those ancient connections are still written in our DNA today. Scientists have discovered something remarkable. If you're of European or Asian descent, roughly 2 to 4% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. If you trace your ancestry to Melanesia, that number jumps to about 5% from Denisovans. These aren't tiny traces from some long-ago accident. These are substantial genetic signatures that tell us our ancestors didn't just encounter other human species, they formed relationships with them. The evidence for this comes from one of the most extraordinary discoveries in human genetics. Deep in Denisova Cave in Siberia, scientists found the remains of a girl they nicknamed Denny. What made Denny special wasn't just her age, around 90,000 years old, but her parentage. Genetic analysis revealed that her mother was a Neanderthal and her father was a Denisovan. This was a first-generation hybrid, proof that different human species weren't just capable of producing offspring together, they were doing it successfully. But Denny wasn't some rare exception. The genetic patterns we see in modern populations suggest that interbreeding happened multiple times, across different geographic regions, over thousands of years. This wasn't a single Romeo and Juliet story between star-crossed species. This was more like an ancient version of international exchange programs, happening again and again across the prehistoric world. What's truly fascinating is what this tells us about the nature of these encounters. The old Hollywood version of human expansion painted a picture of violent conquest, with our ancestors sweeping across continents and wiping out the competition. But the genetic evidence suggests something far more complex and, frankly, more interesting. These were relationships, not just raids. Think about what successful interbreeding actually requires. It's not just genetic compatibility, though that's remarkable enough between species that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years. It requires sustained contact, mutual attraction, and some level of social acceptance. You can't maintain genetic flow between populations that are constantly at war. The geographic patterns of ancient DNA in modern populations paint a picture of widespread, peaceful coexistence. Europeans carry more Neanderthal ancestry than Africans because our ancestors encountered Neanderthals as they expanded out of Africa. Melanesians carry Denisovan DNA because their ancestors traveled through regions where Denisovans lived. These genetic signatures follow the migration routes, telling us that interbreeding was part of the expansion process, not separate from it. Consider what this actually means for our understanding of human survival. Our ancestors weren't just outcompeting other human species through superior technology or social organization. They were absorbing them, incorporating their genetic strengths, and in many ways, ensuring that the best adaptations from all human species would survive into the future. It was survival through integration rather than elimination. This changes everything about how we think about extinction and survival. When we say Neanderthals went extinct, that's only partially true. Their bodies disappeared, their distinct culture faded away, but their genes lived on. In fact, there's more Neanderthal DNA walking around the planet today than ever existed in the original Neanderthal populations. The same is true for Denisovans. Extinction became transformation, and our ancestors became the carriers of an entire family tree of human adaptations. But here's where things get interesting from a numbers perspective. The absorption of Neanderthals and Denisovans wasn't just about love conquering all. It was about mathematics, and the math was working against the smaller populations from the start. Picture a small town where everyone knows everyone, and then imagine a major city expanding right next to it. Even if the small town residents are perfectly friendly and welcome newcomers, what happens over time? The distinctive character of the small town gets diluted simply through the numbers game. This is essentially what happened to our ancient relatives, but on a species level. Population geneticists have run the models, and they tell a fascinating story. When you have a smaller population encountering a much larger one, even a small amount of interbreeding each generation creates what scientists call genetic swamping. It's not that anyone gets wiped out violently. It's that the larger population provides so many more potential mates that the genetic signature of the smaller group gets gradually absorbed into the bigger gene pool. Recent research using advanced genetic tools has revealed that Neanderthal population sizes were significantly smaller than previously estimated. Scientists now believe that the effective population of Neanderthals was revised down from about 34 breeding individuals down to about 24. This happened because a significant amount of that apparent diversity came from DNA sequences that had been lifted from modern humans with their much larger population. Think about it like this. If a Neanderthal community of 50 people encounters a human group of 500, the math is pretty straightforward. Even if only 1% of matings each generation cross species lines, the Neanderthal genetic markers get diluted at a predictable rate. Within a few dozen generations, you'd have people who carry Neanderthal genes but look and act essentially human. The genetic evidence reveals something remarkable about the timing of these encounters. Akey's team identified a first wave of contact about 200-250,000 years ago, another wave 100-120,000 years ago, and the largest one about 50-60,000 years ago. This wasn't a single moment of contact, but multiple waves of interaction across hundreds of thousands of years. The archaeological evidence supports this mathematical model beautifully. We see sustained contact between species across thousands of years, not sudden replacement events. Cultural exchange was happening alongside genetic mixing. Neanderthal tool techniques show up in early human sites. Human innovations appear in late Neanderthal settlements. This wasn't conquest followed by cultural domination. This was gradual integration, with the larger population naturally becoming the dominant cultural force simply through numbers. What's remarkable is that this process reached a tipping point around 40,000 years ago, when human populations had grown large enough that demographic replacement became inevitable. The models suggest that once human groups reached a certain critical mass in any region, the absorption process accelerated rapidly. It wasn't that Neanderthals suddenly became less successful at survival. It's that they became mathematically overwhelmed by the sheer reproductive potential of the larger human populations. Gene flow patterns indicate this wasn't a one-way street either. Scientists have discovered that Neanderthals have 2.5 to 3.7% human ancestry, meaning humans were contributing genetic material to Neanderthal populations, just as Neanderthals were contributing to human ones. But because human populations were larger and growing faster, their genetic signature remained dominant, while beneficial genes from other species got incorporated selectively. The mathematics of population genetics favored integration over separation, absorption over coexistence. The truly amazing part of this story isn't just that our ancestors absorbed other human species, but that the genetic mixing made them stronger. Those ancient relationships weren't just romantic encounters. They were inadvertent survival upgrades that are still benefiting us today. Consider your immune system for a moment. If you're of European descent, parts of your ability to fight off diseases come directly from Neanderthal genes that your ancestors picked up tens of thousands of years ago. Scientists have identified specific immune system variants that were inherited from Neanderthals and are still actively protecting people today. It's like getting a software update from a different operating system that happens to be really good at handling certain types of viruses. Research shows that when modern humans met Neanderthals in Europe, and the two species began interbreeding many thousands of years ago, the exchange left humans with gene variations that have increased the ability of those who carry them to ward off infection. Scientists have found that the TL-6-10 cluster is among the genes presenting the highest Neanderthal ancestry in both Europeans and Asians. These toll-like receptor genes are expressed on the cell surface, where they detect and respond to components of bacteria, fungi, and parasites. They're essential for eliciting inflammatory and antimicrobial responses. The benefits weren't limited to disease resistance either. When humans moved into colder European climates, they inherited Neanderthal genetic variants that helped them adapt to frigid temperatures. Neanderthal origin genes are concentrated in areas of the modern human genome that regulate the appearance of skin and hair, suggesting the genes were beneficial to modern humans by giving them characteristics that helped them adapt to colder climates, like thicker body hair. Neanderthals had been perfecting cold weather survival for hundreds of thousands of years. And through interbreeding, humans got that expertise instantly instead of having to evolve it slowly over millennia. The Denisovan contribution is equally impressive, particularly for people whose ancestors traveled to high altitudes. In places like Tibet, where the air is thin and oxygen is scarce, populations carry Denisovan genes that help them process oxygen more efficiently. Research has found that Tibetans are inheritors of the ancient Denisovan trait of being able to regulate blood oxygenation. Without these genetic variants, settling in high mountain regions would have been nearly impossible for early humans. The Denisovans had already solved the high-altitude survival problem, and they passed that solution along through interbreeding. What's fascinating is that natural selection has been actively maintaining these beneficial hybrid genes. Scientists have found that the archaic-like variants are associated with an increase in the activity of immune genes and with greater reactivity to pathogens. If the genetic contributions from other human species were just random, you'd expect them to fade away over time through genetic drift. Instead, positive selection has been keeping the useful variants and letting the less beneficial ones disappear. Modern populations are essentially carrying a curated collection of the best genetic innovations from multiple human species. Think of it like having access to a massive library of survival solutions that took hundreds of thousands of years to develop. Through genetic mixing, our ancestors gained immediate access to adaptations for cold climates, high altitudes, disease resistance, and who knows what other challenges. It was like downloading specialized apps for survival challenges they hadn't even encountered yet. Research has also found that specific beneficial genes have been selected for different purposes. One study found that about 20% of Neanderthal genes live on in modern humans, concentrated in functions that were immediately useful for survival. Scientists have discovered that one Neanderthal haplotype on chromosome 12, overlapping the antiviral OAS1, OAS2, and OAS3 genes, and present at frequencies of about 30% in all non-African groups, has been found to reduce the odds to develop severe COVID-19 by 22%. The geographic patterns we see today reflect this ancient genetic inheritance perfectly. Europeans carry more cold adaptation genes from Neanderthals. Melanesians and some Asian populations carry Denisovan high-altitude variants. African populations, whose ancestors had less contact with other human species, rely more on their own genetic innovations, but still carry traces of ancient mixing from early encounters. Through absorption and selective preservation of beneficial genes, our ancestors didn't just survive the competition with other human species. They became the living repositories of their genetic wisdom. Extinction became transformation, and we became the keepers of an entire family tree of human adaptations. As one researcher put it, half of the Neanderthal genome is still around, in small pieces scattered around modern humans. The absorption story might have continued indefinitely, with different human species blending together across the landscape of Europe and Asia. But around 40,000 years ago, something fundamental changed. The gradual process of integration suddenly accelerated, and within just a few thousand years, all the other human species had vanished completely. What happened at this critical threshold that turned slow absorption into rapid extinction? Think of it like a company that's been steadily losing market share for years, and then suddenly faces a perfect storm of challenges all at once. The slow decline becomes a dramatic collapse, not because any single factor was insurmountable, but because multiple pressures converged at exactly the wrong moment. This is what happened to our ancient relatives around 40,000 years ago. The archaeological evidence shows us a picture of remarkably rapid change. Scientists call it the Middle to Upper Paleolithic transition, but that technical name disguises how revolutionary this moment actually was. Near full replacement of Middle Paleolithic Mousterian stone technology, with modern human Upper Paleolithic orignation stone technology across Europe, occurred from 41,000 to 39,000 years ago. Imagine if every factory in Europe switched from one manufacturing system to a completely different one within the span of just 2,000 years. That's the kind of technological revolution we're talking about. The earliest bones in Europe date to roughly 43,000 years ago in Bulgaria, Italy, and Britain. This wave of modern humans replaced Neanderthals. But this wasn't just a simple story of one group moving in and another moving out. Recently discovered remains in southern Europe show that at least one Neanderthal had been alive 44,000 years ago, while the oldest Homo sapiens remains have been dated to 43,000 years ago. The timelines were incredibly tight. What makes this collapse even more remarkable is how geographically coordinated it was. By between 44,200 and 40,600 BP, Neanderthals vanished from northwestern Europe. The pattern spread from east to west, like a wave rolling across the continent. This wasn't random local extinctions happening at different times. This was a systematic replacement that followed predictable geographic patterns. The speed of this change suggests we're looking at a threshold effect rather than a gradual process. For tens of thousands of years, different human species had coexisted, interbred, and shared territories. Then, in what amounts to an evolutionary eye blink, the balance shifted dramatically. Multiple factors that had been building slowly suddenly reached a tipping point where the system couldn't maintain its previous equilibrium. The most recent fossil and archaeological evidence of Neanderthals is from about 40,000 years ago in Europe. After that point, they appear to have gone physically extinct, although part of them lives on in the DNA of humans alive today. This timing is not coincidental. Something about the conditions around 40,000 years ago created a perfect storm that overwhelmed the adaptive capacity of every human species, except one. Archaeological sites from this period tell a story of dramatic cultural disruption alongside the demographic changes. GS12, G7, and G10 are coeval with a regional pattern of culturally near-sterile layers within Europe's diachronous archaeologic transition from Neanderthals to modern human origination. These sterile layers represent periods when nobody was making tools or living in the usual sites, suggesting population crashes so severe that entire regions were temporarily abandoned. The convergence of all these factors around the 40,000-year mark wasn't coincidence. It represents the moment when the slow-burning pressures that had been building for millennia finally reached a critical threshold where the existing system of coexistence and gradual absorption could no longer be sustained. While our ancestors were growing in numbers and technological sophistication, the planet itself was becoming increasingly hostile to all human life. Around 40,000 years ago, Earth experienced one of the most severe climate disruptions of the entire Ice Age, and this environmental crisis became the match that lit the fire of the final collapse. Scientists call it Heinrich Event 4, but that clinical name doesn't capture the sheer brutality of what happened to European climate around 40,000 years ago. Picture the worst winter you've ever experienced, then imagine it lasting not for months, but for centuries. About 40,800 years ago, lasting about 600 years. It was cold enough that average temperatures dropped to below zero, creating year-round permafrost. The layers of the stalagmites showed a series of prolonged extreme cold and excessively dry conditions in Europe between 44,000 and 40,000 years ago. They highlight a cycle of temperatures gradually cooling, staying very cold for centuries to millennia, and then warming again very abruptly. This wasn't just cold weather. This was a fundamental reorganization of European ecosystems that lasted longer than the entire recorded history of human civilization. The impact on the landscape was devastating. Forest was generally more abundant in Europe during interstadials, while steppe landscape advanced during stadials. The forests that had sustained both Neanderthal and human populations for thousands of years were replaced by harsh, treeless steppes. It was like watching the Amazon rainforest transform into the Siberian tundra in fast forward. For Neanderthals, who had evolved specifically for European conditions over hundreds of thousands of years, this climate crisis was particularly catastrophic. The researchers compared these paleoclimate records with archaeological records of Neanderthal artifacts and found a correlation between the cold periods, known as stadials, and an absence of Neanderthal tools. This indicates the Neanderthal population greatly reduced during the cold periods. The crisis forced Neanderthal populations into an increasingly desperate retreat. It is postulated that Iberian Neanderthals persisted until about 35,000 years ago, as indicated by the date range of transitional lithic assemblages. The last Neanderthal fossils or Mousterian archaeological sites, as the typical Neanderthal culture is called, come from the southern half of Europe. The Iberian Peninsula plays a fundamental role here. It is clear that Neanderthals spent their final centuries in sunny Andalusia. Think of it like a zombie apocalypse movie, but instead of zombies, it's an advancing wall of ice and cold that forces survivors into smaller and smaller safe zones. The Neanderthals were being pushed into refugia, small pockets of relatively habitable land in southern Spain and Italy where they could still find food and shelter. But these refuges were like isolated islands in an ocean of environmental hostility. Their extinction is statistically placed around 40 Ka Hayam et al., 2014, during marine isotopic stage 3 MIS3, and almost in coincidence with Heinrich Event 4, which is a sudden global shift towards colder temperatures. The timing was devastating. Just as Neanderthal populations were being compressed into their smallest viable territories, they also had to compete for those same refuges with the expanding human populations who were better adapted to harsh conditions. The researchers believe that modern humans survived these cold stadial periods because they were better adapted to their environment than the Neanderthals. Neanderthals were skilled hunters and had learned how to control fire, but they had a less diverse diet than modern humans, living largely on meat from the animals they had successfully pursued. These food sources would naturally become scarce during colder periods, making the Neanderthals more vulnerable to rapid environmental change. The psychological impact of this environmental crisis can't be underestimated either. Imagine being part of a population that had successfully inhabited Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. Watching your traditional territories become uninhabitable within a few generations. The stress of constant retreat, combined with shrinking resources and growing competition, created conditions where even the most resilient populations would struggle to survive. This suggests that ecologic stress during stadial expansion of steppe landscape caused a diachronous pattern of depopulation of Neanderthals, which facilitated repopulation by modern humans who appear to have been better adapted to this environment. The climate crisis didn't just kill Neanderthals directly. It created conditions where human advantages in flexibility, cooperation, and resource management became decisive factors for survival. But here's the remarkable thing about this story of extinction. In the most important sense, the Neanderthals and Denisovans never really disappeared at all. While their populations vanished and their cultures faded into archaeological memory, their genetic wisdom lived on, woven into the DNA of the survivors. The final collapse wasn't the end of their contribution to human evolution. It was actually the beginning of their most lasting legacy. Despite their species demise, fascinating remnants of Neanderthals can be found in the genetic material of some modern humans. Perhaps the most surprising fact was evidence of interbreeding. that has left traces of DNA in living humans today. Many Europeans and Asians have between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA, while African people south of the Sahara have almost zero. Modern research continues to reveal new ways these ancient genes benefit us today. Every single Neanderthal who ever lived, across hundreds of thousands of years, numbered at most in the tens of thousands. But today, with billions of people carrying Neanderthal genetic variants, there's more Neanderthal DNA walking around on Earth than ever existed in the original species. It's like a library that burned down, but not before all the most valuable books were copied and distributed to millions of other libraries around the world. The selection process for which genes survived wasn't random either. Scientists don't yet know the full extent, but they're learning it can be both helpful and harmful. For example, Neanderthal DNA has been linked to autoimmune diseases like Graves' disease and rheumatoid arthritis, but the beneficial genes were strongly selected for and maintained. Scientists continue discovering new examples of how these inherited traits protect us from diseases. The geographic patterns of this genetic legacy tell the story of ancient migrations and contacts. Research shows some African populations have almost no Neanderthal DNA, while those from European or Asian backgrounds have 1% to 2%. Denisovan DNA is barely detectable in most parts of the world, but makes up 4% to 6% of the DNA of people in Melanesia, which extends from New Guinea to the Fiji Islands. These percentages might seem small, but they represent successful genes that have been maintained and spread through human populations for 40,000 years. What's particularly fascinating is how these ancient genes continue to influence modern human traits and health. Research has linked Neanderthal genetic variants to skin and hair color, behavioral traits, skull shape, and type 2 diabetes. One study found that people who report feeling more pain than others are likely to carry a Neanderthal pain receptor. Another found that a third of women in Europe inherited a Neanderthal receptor for the hormone progesterone, which is associated with increased fertility and fewer miscarriages. Much less is known about our genetic legacy from Denisovans, although some research has linked genes from them to fat metabolism and better adaptation to high altitudes. Manasa Raghavan, a human genetics expert at the University of Chicago, said a stretch of Denisovan DNA has been found in Tibetans, who continue to live and thrive in low-oxygen environments today. The survival of these genetic variants represents a kind of insurance policy for our species. Climate change, new diseases, environmental challenges that we can't even imagine yet. All of these future threats might be met by genetic solutions that were originally developed by our extinct relatives hundreds of thousands of years ago. As Zeberg, who collaborates closely with Pabo, noted, half of the Neanderthal genome is still around, in small pieces scattered around modern humans. This genetic legacy also provides crucial lessons about extinction and survival. Some researchers think that we can include Neanderthals in an early phase of the sixth extinction, since their disappearance as a distinct species was partly because of the success of H. sapiens in gaining control of natural resources and space. Even if, as many archaeologists now believe, Neanderthals did not undergo full extinction, but were instead assimilated into human populations. They did so because they were outcompeted for resources by their human neighbors. The Neanderthals and Denisovans may have lost the battle for survival as distinct species, but they won something more important: immortality through genetic integration. Their wisdom, encoded in DNA sequences that took hundreds of thousands of years to perfect, continues to help modern humans adapt and survive. In the deepest sense, they didn't go extinct at all. They became part of us, and we became the living continuation of their evolutionary legacy. So here we are, the last human species standing. After walking through this incredible story of survival and extinction, of absorption and transformation, we come to the fundamental question: what actually made the difference? Why did we survive when 8 other human species, some of them seemingly better adapted than us, disappeared into history? The answer isn't what you might expect. It wasn't superior strength. Neanderthals were physically more powerful. It wasn't bigger brains. Neanderthals had larger cranial capacity on average. It wasn't even better tools initially. Neanderthals had perfected sophisticated technology over hundreds of thousands of years. The difference came down to something more subtle, but infinitely more powerful: our ability to cooperate at unprecedented scales. Think about it like a multiplayer video game where some players are incredibly skilled individually, but others figure out how to coordinate teams effectively. The team players don't need to be the strongest individual warriors to dominate the game. They win because they can organize, share resources, and respond to challenges collectively in ways that individual excellence simply cannot match. Our ancestors developed what scientists call Dunbar's number, the cognitive ability to maintain stable social relationships with around 150 individuals. But more importantly, they learned to connect these groups into larger networks that could span continents. Trading between groups to obtain materials and to cement alliances is a hallmark of modern human behavior. By 130,000 years ago, hominins were exchanging materials over distances of over 300 km. These weren't just trade relationships. They were survival insurance policies. When environmental challenges struck, our ancestors had something no other human species possessed: a continental-scale mutual aid network. The social bonds that were forged by exchanging materials between groups may have been critical for survival during times of environmental change, when one group relied on the resources or territories of a distant group. Modern foragers use social ties to mitigate the effects of famines and droughts. Flexibility was another crucial advantage, but not the kind you might think. This wasn't physical flexibility, but cognitive and cultural adaptability. While other human species became highly specialized for specific environments and hunting strategies, our ancestors remained generalists who could rapidly adjust their behavior based on changing circumstances. When Heinrich Event 4 brought devastating cold to Europe, Neanderthals struggled because their entire survival strategy was optimized for European conditions. Our ancestors, with their more flexible toolkit of survival strategies, could adapt more quickly. Language played a revolutionary role in amplifying all these advantages. The use of color, incised symbols, decorative objects, and language are part of this capacity for communication. Language makes it possible to convey complex ideas to others. Communication of ideas and circumstances via language would have made survival in a changing world much easier. But language wasn't just about talking. It was about building collective intelligence that could transcend individual limitations. Perhaps most critically, our ancestors developed what we might call innovation networks. While Neanderthals typically lived in small, relatively isolated groups, humans created interconnected communities that could share discoveries rapidly across vast distances. A breakthrough in tool-making in one location could spread across continents within generations rather than millennia. This meant that the accumulated wisdom of thousands of groups could be available to any single community facing a crisis. The convergence of these advantages created a survival system that was far more than the sum of its parts. Cooperation enabled information sharing, which accelerated innovation, which improved survival rates, which allowed for larger populations, which made cooperation even more effective. It was a positive feedback loop that created exponential advantages over competing human species. During the critical 40,000-year threshold, when climate crisis and competition intensified, these advantages became decisive. While other human species faced challenges as isolated populations, our ancestors could draw on the collective resources, knowledge, and support of a continental network. It wasn't just about being better adapted individuals. It was about being part of a better adapted system. This explains why absorption rather than violent conquest characterized most of our interactions with other human species. Our ancestors weren't trying to eliminate competitors. They were incorporating useful traits and individuals into an ever-expanding cooperative network. The system was so effective at integration that it could absorb the genetic and cultural contributions of other species while maintaining its own coherence and growth trajectory. The survival strategies that carried our ancestors through ice ages and environmental catastrophes aren't just historical curiosities. They're the same fundamental approaches we need today to navigate challenges that would make Heinrich Event 4 look like a minor inconvenience. Climate change, global pandemics, technological disruption, and planetary-scale environmental degradation all require exactly the same cooperative, adaptive, and networked responses that got us this far. Think about COVID-19 for a moment. Here was a global challenge that couldn't be solved by any single nation, no matter how advanced or powerful. The virus didn't respect borders, and neither could effective responses to it. Vaccine development required international scientific collaboration. Distribution needed global coordination. Yet, our response revealed how much we still struggle with the very cooperation that made our species successful. Climate change is arguably the greatest test of our cooperative capacity since the ice ages. Just like our ancestors, we face an environmental crisis that requires species-level coordination to survive. Climate change can only be dealt with by unparalleled levels of global cooperation. It will compel countries to question economic models, invent new industries, and recognize the moral responsibility that wealthy nations have to the rest of the world. But cooperation is hard, even when survival depends on it. The same challenges that made cooperation difficult for our ancestors still affect us today. Because the effects of climate change cannot be attributed to each specific country that causes greenhouse emissions, all countries are at the same time culprits and victims of the problem. There are incentives for non-cooperation, including the free-riding factor. Because greenhouse gases mix globally in the atmosphere, damage is not necessarily attributed to the country where the emissions came from. Yet we're also seeing the emergence of exactly the kind of networked intelligence that characterized our ancestors' success. Artificial intelligence technologies are creating new forms of collective problem-solving that could amplify human cooperation in unprecedented ways. AI will drive efficiency optimizations and enable us to process information and coordinate responses at scales that would have been impossible for previous generations. Modern technology is recreating the innovation networks that gave our ancestors their survival advantage, but at planetary scale. AI is already the main driver of emerging technologies like big data, robotics, and IoT. Innovations like the internet and networked AI are enabling exactly the kind of rapid information sharing and collective intelligence that helped humans survive previous crises. The question is whether we can scale up our cooperative instincts to match our technological capabilities. Our ancestors survived not because they were individually superior, but because they built systems that could support cooperation even during times of extreme stress. They created networks of mutual aid that functioned across tribal boundaries and vast distances. Today's challenges require the same systematic approach to cooperation, but at unprecedented scales. International agreements like the Paris Agreement create frameworks that bring jurisdictions together to exchange information and coordinate responses. The scale of the climate crisis demands a unified global response. Through partnerships that pool resources, share technologies, and create coordinated policies, we can begin to address this immense challenge. Just as our ancestors' survival depended on continental-scale cooperation 40,000 years ago, our survival today depends on planetary-scale cooperation. Here's the beautiful thing about being human. Our evolution didn't stop when the ice ages ended. While other species evolve primarily through genetic change over thousands of generations, we've developed the ability to evolve culturally and technologically within single generations. The same cooperative intelligence that helped our ancestors survive environmental catastrophes is now accelerating at an unprecedented pace, giving us tools they could never have imagined. Human evolution has shifted from biological to technological and cultural acceleration. About 55% of organizations have adopted AI to varying degrees, suggesting increased automation for many businesses in the near future. But this isn't replacing the fundamental survival strategies that got us this far. It's amplifying them. Artificial intelligence is positioned as a key driver of a new evolutionary stage of human knowledge, complementing human intelligence and facilitating sophisticated collective intelligence. Think of AI like having a supernatural memory palace shared across all humanity. Where our ancestors could only remember and share what they personally experienced, we now have systems that can instantly access the accumulated knowledge of our entire species. AI will enhance our vision and hearing capabilities, remove language barriers, and reduce time to find information we care about. It's like giving every human access to the collective intelligence of all the innovation networks our ancestors ever built. The same principles that made our ancestors successful are being amplified by technology in remarkable ways. Network effects that once required months to traverse continents now happen in milliseconds. Innovations that once took generations to spread can now be shared globally in real time. The social networks that our ancestors used to coordinate responses to environmental crises can now coordinate responses to planetary challenges. But technology is just a tool. The fundamental challenge remains the same. Whether technological amplification helps us survive and thrive depends on whether we can maintain the cooperative spirit that got us this far. The risks are real. Between 2023 and 2028, 44% of workers' skills will be disrupted. If companies don't have steps in place to upskill their workforces, this could undermine the very cooperative networks that our survival depends on. Yet the opportunities are equally profound. AI will reduce human error in many contexts: driving, workplace, medicine, and more. AI will help people manage the increasingly complex world we are forced to navigate. These are exactly the kinds of collective problem-solving capabilities that helped our ancestors navigate complex environmental and social challenges. The story of human survival is ultimately a story about choosing cooperation over competition, adaptation over specialization, and networks over isolation. These principles worked for our ancestors 40,000 years ago, and they're just as relevant today. The difference is that we now have the tools to implement them at planetary scale. So here we are, the last humans standing, not because we were the strongest or the smartest, but because we learned to work together in ways no other species ever managed. We built networks that spanned continents, shared innovations across generations, and stayed flexible when others became too specialized. You carry within you the genes of the Neanderthals and Denisovans, the cooperative spirit that made us survivors, and the same adaptive wisdom that helped our ancestors navigate ice ages and environmental crises. Those ancient networks of mutual aid and shared knowledge are still with us today, helping us face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through the stranger corners of history. Until we meet again in another time and place, may your own challenges be met with the same cooperative spirit, adaptive wisdom, and networked resilience that carried our ancestors through ice ages and made us the last human standing.